Namaste and good evening, everyone. I, Ritika Gupta, Assistant Director at IMPRI Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, extend my heartiest welcome to you all to this hashtag Web Policy Talk. Today, we are here for a special talk on reform, lessons for urban governance, futures from the pandemic. The speaker for today is Dr. Shubhagato Dasgupta. The lecture is being organized by Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies at IMPRI. I would now like to welcome our moderator for today, Dr. Soumyadeep Chattopadhyay, who is Associate Professor at Visva University, Shantiniketan, West Bengal, and visiting Senior Fellow at IMPRI. Sir, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritika, and good evening to all of you. Again, on behalf of this Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies, I welcome you all to this City Conversation series. And before the formal beginning, let me just give you a brief backdrop about this conversation series and about today's talk. It is now a well-established fact that this COVID-19 is widening the existing spatial, social, and economic inequalities in cities all over the world. And deep-rooted inequalities in cities in India have heavily influenced the degree and nature of these COVID-19 impacts. It has become clear that vulnerability to COVID-19 depends on several conditions, where in a city a person lives and works, gender, age, the pre-existing health conditions, income level, type of home, access to basic services such as health facilities, transportation, clean water, and so on. And COVID-19 has also highlighted the critical role of local government as frontline responders in crisis response, recovery, and rebuilding. At the same time, the cities have experienced some positive short-term environmental impacts. For example, clean air in cities known for toxic air quality, especially owing to the lockdowns. COVID-19 has also shown a green urban future is possible. Several cities have encouraged for example, the biking and walking as safe alternatives to public transports during the COVID-19 outbreak. Now, overall, this COVID-19 has laid bare and indeed heightened both these challenges and these opportunities. It is important to avoid return to the pre-pandemic status quo, transforming cities for future resilience, inclusion, green and economic sustainability has never been more urgent. And cities can manage this crisis and emerge as the engines of growth, but this requires conscious policy choices. Today's City Conversation series talks plans to engage with the policy options that are available, policy choices that could determine our resilience against future pandemics, and more broadly to set cities on a course towards sustainability and equality. And for that, we are honored to have with us Dr. Shubhagato Dasgupta, and a very distinguished set of panelists, academicians, urban researchers, and urban administrators. And just let me briefly introduce them. Dr. Shubhagato Dasgupta is a senior fellow at CPR, and he's the director of Scaling City Institutions for India Sanitation Initiative. His current research focuses on drinking water and sanitation, urban, private, and public finance, housing and slum rehabilitation, and urban environmental infrastructure planning. He has also worked on issues of urban development with public, private, and multilateral and non-governmental organizations, including the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, the Infrastructure Development Finance Company, and the Housing and Urban Development Corporation. And today also we have with us Professor Santosh Mehrotra, who was associated with Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies, Jawaharlal University, and also served as the director of Institute of Applied Manpower Research. And he also headed the Rural Development Division and the Development Policy Division of the Planning Commission in India. And he also worked with the United Nations Development Program and UNICEF. And also we have with us Professor Sauvanic, who is the professor of Department of Architecture, Town and Regional Planning, founder director, School of Ecology, Infrastructure and Human Settlement Management at the Indian Institute of Engineering, Science and Technology, IIEST Shibpur. We have with us Mr. Tikender Panwar, who is the former deputy mayor of Shimla and the visiting senior fellow of IMPRI. And we have with us Mrs. Sauli Manikar, who's a senior fellow at WARF Mumbai, and we expect two other panelists to join us shortly. Mr. Samir Unale, who is the Joint Commissioner, Department of Municipal Administration and Government of Maharashtra, and Dr. Simi Mehta, who is the CEO and Editorial Director of IMPRI. So with this brief introduction about the talk and about our panelist and the speaker today, let me now request Professor Santosh Mehrotra to give her opening remark. So it's over to you, Professor Mehrotra, and then I would request Dr. Dasgupta to begin his lecture. So it's over to Professor Mehrotra. Are you there?
I'm very much there.
Okay, sir.
Sorry.
Okay, sir. It's over to you, sir,
Indeed.
for your opening remark.
Yeah, I'm going to be very brief, actually. I'm very much looking forward to listening to our distinguished speaker. I have to say that this is not an area I work in, but let me say two things, and that's all I will say, in fact, and perhaps I can come in towards the end once I've heard the others. You spoke very rightly, Dr. Chattopadhyay, about how cities are becoming unequal. But you know, if you look at the more macro economy, it is truly shocking that the government can go on claiming that we are in the middle of a V-shaped recovery, and in 2021, FY 2022, we'll see a bounce back of the Indian economy, when in fact it's nowhere close to being a V-shaped recovery. It is merely a rebound from a lockdown, from the worst contraction of the economy in 40 years. And the worst contraction of India has to be compared to the contraction which took place in the G20 countries or the rest of the world, where our contraction is actually the worst. But let's not focus on all of that. I think my concern is about the inequality, which is what all of us are concerned about, which will be the subject of this discussion as well, I assume. Because there are several dimensions of this, of the K-shape of this inequality, because we are already an extremely unequal country. And our Gini coefficient for income inequality is now comparable to that of the most unequal countries in the world, whether it's South Africa or Brazil. As though that was not worrying enough, that level of inequality in a country where we have perhaps the largest number of poor in the world is the most serious concern. And on top of this, you get a K-shaped recovery post the COVID, and we still have to wait to see when the economy will recover, considering that we are well into a second wave. But just to give a few more dimensions to this, what I believe is going to be a K-shaped recovery, which is obviously going to impact our cities versus versus the rural areas. I mean, one dimension is, in a sense, that we keep claiming that the rural areas are doing better, when in fact they are the ones who've suffered a massive decline in incomes, because millions of people have gone back to agriculture, as a result of which they are jobless there and wages are low there. This has implications for the rural-urban divide, which is already very severe in our country. There's another dimension that our organized sector has done rather well. You know, profitability in the organized sector, especially of listed companies, was not only good, it was actually so good that it was their profits which enabled the economy to, in the second quarter, to appear as though it was in positive territory as opposed to negative territory. So you have a sharp divide between the organized sector and the unorganized sector, which is suffering very badly. The MSMEs are all in the unorganized sector. And secondly, within the organized sector, as I just said, there's a difference between how the profits of the companies are doing versus what has happened to wages, because one of the reasons why profits are better, earnings are better for listed companies, is because organized sector firms have actually reduced their workers, and they've reduced wages. Now, when you take this, when you look at all of this, I want to give a particular focus to the subject of education and how online education is deepening and already extremely entrenched inequality in our educational system. So who's still going to school? Those who have smartphones. How many people have smartphones? Well, a maximum of 400 million people in our country have smartphones, but our population is 1.34 billion. What is the meaning of having online education then for the children of the remainder, especially those in rural areas? And we were being told all along that Digital India has started 5 years ago, and everyone will have access to all the beautiful things that come with Digital India. And the tragedy is that village schools, Sarkari schools, are actually closed. Children have already lost a year of education. They may lose more as we move forward. And this is despite the fact that in 2014, you know, the Secretary of Education told me, when the gentleman who was the Secretary of Education in 2014, he told me we had already created the infrastructure for about 1,000 channels on television, which would have enabled schooling and training of teachers and classes to be taking place through that mechanism had that been taken forward. But this government actually abandoned that, and that's not being taken forward. So you have the current situation, and this is my last point. You have the current situation where village schools are still practically closed and city schools are doing fine, especially if the children have smartphones. Well, let me stop there and hand over to our main speaker, and back to you, Shomyati. You're muted. Yeah.
No,
yeah.
Thank you, Professor Mehrotra. Now, just may I now request our speaker, Dr. Shubhagato Dasgupta, for your lecture. So over to you.
Thank you so much. Good evening. Thanks so much for those opening comments, Dr. Mehrotra. Within this mega picture that you alluded to so succinctly about the key social parameters that are at stress in India, this study, which we've called Reform, is essentially around what we experienced during the period of, the study was conducted between July to December last year, very much within the first wave of the pandemic, but just soon after the lockdown, the national lockdown. It was undertaken at CPR, but we had a generous partner in the FCDO, the British government, who funded this work, and I must thank them in right up front, Mr. Jagan Shah, Sanjukta, and Anirban for funding this work. I'm also presenting on behalf of a whole set of researchers, and the study looked at South Asia more broadly, but was very specific in its recommendations for India. And so I was just one of the participants orchestrating this work. And we had specialist public health people, livelihoods people, Sabina Diwan, and planners and economists as part of the team, and a large set of younger researchers and field researchers. The report itself, which will be out, I guess, early next month, finally, will be in two sections. One will be a set of annexures, and the first will be the main report, which will document all that's happened in the sphere of urban planning and urban services, during the first wave of COVID. The objective specifically was to look at pandemics in a more and its impact on urban planning in a longer term sense, in history in an evolutionary manner, and also to look at not only typically urban spheres, such as planning and affordable housing and slum redevelopment, but also to look at aspects about healthcare and livelihoods as they affect our urban centers. Means, as you laid out again, Dr. Mehrotra, means it has been a huge disaster, especially for the poorest, and which is a very large proportion of the population, not only the poorest, even the poor or even the lower middle class. And as the World Population Review reported, the Gini coefficient in India, to allude to your point about increasing inequalities, has significantly taken a jump. And there are these numbers out of earlier this year, where we have seen that even there have been lots of stress on the economy, but also very much in the domestic social sectors, including in healthcare. Much of healthcare was regular healthcare was suspended. That led to 3 million unintended pregnancies as a case. And the social programs that the government announced in the wake of this were very slow to take up. And your example of education and the reluctance to support a more existing set of infrastructure delivery mechanisms in already invested in the past, and going for newer methods is one example, but this is across various programs that the government announced. Within that, the circumstances of slums are particularly critical because this has, after all, been an early urban disease, and vulnerabilities in the slums have been highlighted, have come to light quite a bit, including the outmigration that happened from the lower income areas in our larger cities. Taking a historic view, essentially urban planning and pandemics have a long history of working together. For much of the known history of man, urban planning was the key instrument through which pandemics of this nature were addressed. A series of urban design planning, the evolution of urban planning and design is quite closely connected to a lot of disasters, quite a few pandemics, but also a lot of urban disasters like the fire in London, etc. But this diagram kind of shows that in the early phase up to the 19th century, when the world had a very flat urban trajectory, it was less than 10% urban population. But it is in those centers, let's say around Constantinople, where all the quarantine efforts and the cities were planned for quarantine spaces, and international trade was regulated through that. And some of the principles, what we have called draconian measures, have come out of these early medieval times when the success of those planning instruments were seen. Further, in the 19th century, with the cholera epidemics, the urban areas got a big urban planning and urban economy coming out of the Industrial Revolution, so a big boost. But some of the infrastructure that we see critical to urban areas, and why urbanization in this phase has really seen a boost from all its history of being at 10% to finishing this decade at 30% and on a higher trajectory, was essentially because of all the urban infrastructure put in terms of water supply, sewerage across the largest cities in the world, very much though driven from the West. In the recent past, in the 20th century onwards, with the discovery and the mass scale use of antibiotics and vaccination, urban planning itself became the second instrument to rely on for meeting pandemics and stresses of this nature, and therefore means reviving or looking at the linkages between urban planning and pandemics has become more difficult, because a solution is seen in the vaccination exercise as in current times. Now, coming back to the studies framework, as I mentioned earlier, the urban sphere today, as understood by the way the current governance framework is laid out, essentially the public spaces, water and sanitation, and housing and slums are very much within the jurisdiction of the local government. Livelihoods and public health and clinical care is something that there is an interface, and much of the impact has been in urban areas, but it is outside what is formally in the control of local bodies. We looked at this over a period of time, a short period of time between July and December last year, and we did ask questions about the early response in terms of the national lockdown, and then the early recovery phase. And based on some of that, our recommendations on mitigation and preparedness have kind of emerged. The study itself, of course, after literature review, we identified 11 cities in which we undertook a press scan. We did city profiles and spatial mapping to understand how the infrastructure densities are. And then we did some empirical work through primary research in these cities. And then based on some expert opinion and workshops, where we've come up with a set of recommendations or guidance on how cities and pandemics could be dealt with in this phase. And it's it means I'm not very sure it's timely enough, but the issue is that many of these are quite structural and will need to be rethought by government at various tiers. And we will come to that later in the presentation. But these were the 11 cities selected. They included larger cities and smaller cities and some medium-sized cities. And alongside this, we were also taking help of some advisors in 3 neighboring countries, and we were trying to understand how their governments responded to. So the first part of the data input came from a massive press scan that we did based on an algorithm that Meltwater has, where a series of multi-tiered search questions are looked at in electronic media. And based on that, we've tried to gauge what the perceptions around the pandemic was, how it was being reflected in different geographies. So, just to present a few of them, for example, public health and clinical care by far was the most reported issue of concern in India and South Asia. But as you will see globally, when compared globally, there were livelihoods and social protection was equally discussed in popular press, unlike that much of discussion in India or South Asia. Across the themes of public spaces, housing and slums, there are these interesting differences and similarities. Social distancing was the big issue around public spaces. Cycling got much more attention internationally than in India. In terms of housing and slums, globally, social distancing was what was being looked at. In India, it was much more about migrant housing and whether they are in slums or not, and how that the issue of migrant housing and urban density needs to be tackled. In water and sanitation and hygiene, community efforts were very widely reported in India as compared to globally, where the issue was equally kind of spread between water sanitation and community efforts. In public health too, clinical care, it was the dominant mode of discussion, issue of discussion was about public health preparedness. There was, after that, the next important issue was about frontline workers. And in South Asia and India, frontline health workers got more attention than in global press. As in livelihoods and social protection, too, while a similar pattern is reported, daily wage dominated the discussion across both in India, South Asia, but also globally. But in the global discussion, there were a few other elements of supply chain dynamics, so strikes and protests as a big issue also discussed. Overall, the literature kind of on India, means not the literature, the press reporting on India showed a more, means the Indian press reported it much more positively compared to the global press. And while 42% of the database looked globally was pessimistic about India's programs, that was only reflected in 25% of the press coverage in India itself. We did this across cities by city size and in the 11 locations we were studying. And clinical means preparedness, health preparedness was overarching the big issue, except in, but it was interesting to see this variation. For example, in Bhubaneswar, there were, given the first wave was mild, so to say, as well as health was, they have a lot of health infrastructure in comparison to the crisis that hit them. It was not so much in the press. In smaller cities too, though, public health concerns were more of a concern than in the larger cities in general. And as a summary, that's how the data shows up. In smaller towns, another big issue was around public health, public space management, which was considerably less in larger cities. Based on our means initial understanding out of this this analysis of what the press was reporting, we then conducted 156 key informant interviews across the 11 cities with government officers, with frontline workers, and with community groups. And we asked sub-questions like, what happened in the city? We were trying to paint a picture of the city, where it originated, how it spread, what was the responses of the cities, etc., and what are the issues of concern in building back better. And then this led us to what are the main recommendations for the study, or the main issues that came out to be of concern in these cities. And I'll just take you through them one at a time. I won't spend too much time on them, given that we have an overall limit in here. But each of these issues are interesting. The first was around wet markets, and the issue that only 14% of them are regulated in India. The wet markets was a concern during COVID too, but even globally, wet markets is where, for example, the most, the best theory around how the zoonotic diseases spread is from wet markets. And in the US too, working in cold temperatures, in congested wet markets has been one of their most super spreader kind of locations in the city. And in India, this part of it is quite unknown given the low registration. There has been some effort that was shaping up earlier, but much of that is yet to happen. It's in the future. Open and green spaces was another big area that came up. And essentially the story was that while there were very tough measures put in during lockdown, post-lockdown, there was actually no care given to this exercise. It was a yes or a no kind of situation. And then all the gains of trying to lock down open spaces was put aside very quickly. One of the biggest issues that came out was intercity and intracity transport, and the horrific images of the mass migration out of cities will remain in our minds forever. But it's very interesting to note that in unlocking some of this, some very interesting examples from cities did come about of how local associations of bus, associations or auto rickshaw associations played a significant role. And there was a policy and city level push on cycling to some extent, but not as much internationally. And here it kind of contrasts with, let's say, what happened globally. Across the world, public transport was maintained. It was not locked down, even during lockdowns. It was regulated, and social distancing was improved, and it was meant for frontline workers because the others were working from home. And in the case of Bogota too, which is well known for its efforts on public transport and cycling, they actually created a new infrastructure around cycling during this period, in contrast to what was happening in India during the lockdown on transport. The next set of recommendations are around building business continuity, and this, of course, has all the three subsectors in it. It means be it the private sector or a local government itself. There isn't really an analysis of what happened with local government finances during this period, but there was lots of overwriting that happened, and how that's going to affect their own ability in the future is not very well documented. But in the private sector, some of that, there are very interesting examples of how certain groups moved from one area of work to another, and this is documented at the city level. Healthcare infrastructure expansion is quite well documented elsewhere too. And so is this issue around integrated strategic planning. And what we find that in smaller and secondary cities where planning and urban management are very weakly integrated, there was a lot of opportunity lost in doing some of this. While in larger cities where they did have some of these war rooms that they set up based on some infrastructure that the government did manage to put in during the smart cities phase, there was some benefits to it. But there, talking to those cities, we did learn that they have issues around data and data validity. But it was effectively used in many cases. In terms of labor issues, they came up a lot in the community. A number of states diluted labor laws during this period in support of the private sector. And there seems to be a very strong demand from people that there has to be non-negotiable aspects of labor laws that need to be built in, even in the lower end of the formal market. Even outside the informal market, this emerged as a big concern. In terms of portability and social security, of course, again, those are big issues that did come up about, and what might be the local government's role in actually executing or ensuring the quick delivery of social security programs is another area that we need to think about. Social security for street vendors came up specifically in the study cities, and we see that in Bhubaneswar as a good example where they have street vending zones and it is kind of monitored and regulated to an extent. The government did have long lists of people who were registered as street vendors. They were, and there were some subsidies and business kind of not loans. There were grants given to them, and that could take place quite easily. While, for example, in Bhubaneswar itself, a lot of the public transport people, be it auto rickshaw drivers, etc., moved to vegetable vending, and they were not a part of this network and could not be supported by the government. So there are issues around street vendors that came up significantly. Finally, on rental housing, for a change emerged as a theme that the government of India wants to discuss now. The formulation of the scheme, though, has lots to be desired. But for since independence, India has focused only on house ownership, and this is a welcome change in the policy direction that government of India has taken up. And in slum upgrading too, we've seen some very new, interesting examples. But slum itself are, of course, the major risk area for pandemics like this, and have seen larger cities being able to put in a lot of resources to manage slums. The example of Dharavi is a global one of how the municipality put in so much resources to tackle the problems there, which may not be possible in other cities across India. But in here, I would want to mention an example that came up, which is about the urban wage employment program that government of Orissa put in place, along with their Jaga mission exercise. What they essentially did was that they helped build this fourth tier of community involvement. This is in support of the COVID, post-COVID recovery in one sense. They were directly supporting self-help groups and slum dwellers associations in wage labor. They used that money to create assets which led to slum upgrading, which is water supply, roads, and electricities in slums. And so they are now in a position to delist 500 out of the 2,500 slums across the state over this period of the pandemic, which is a very good example of how you can use public resources in a very creative way to address many of the concerns coming out of this crisis. Frontline workers, inclusion in insurance and social security, the uptake and the preparedness around this has been slow. And the fourth tier of governance has emerged as an important new area. We have wards and in Gram Panchayats too, but those have not been properly supported in our decentralization effort. The issue around building trust within these communities has emerged in this crisis, and there is a new impetus in a few states other than Orissa also to build back better with community support. And finally, this issue around open data governance and decision making. While there are some early efforts, as I mentioned before, they're far from adequate, and the progress on this, while it seems fast, we've got lots of catching up to do. And just as an example, Johannesburg during this period too, in terms of preparedness from 2013, they had an integrated spatial planning exercise where all departments working on a city share a common database, spatial map, and so it captures a whole set of future plans and current service delivery in that map itself, and they creatively use this for addressing issues coming out of the COVID crisis. Finally, what does this mean for the frameworks, both for disaster resilience and a new framework for public health emergencies? As we are all aware, the use of the Public Health Emergencies Act in India is really old, is 1897, is very draconian in many ways, does not understand the risk sharing of what a pandemic does to all kinds of sectors, looks at clinical care, it looks at only lockdowns and quarantine. And the Disaster Management Act, while it does a better, it understands how disasters can lead to multiple problems, does not have enough on biological disasters itself. So recommendations at the Government of India level would be to look at the space between these two to better develop a framework for long-term progress. So these recommendations are then put into these three broad buckets of building resilience through integrated urban planning, of the division between formal and informal needs to be replaced by a universal framework. And how we get to that, we need lots more discussions on that. And then on what how legal reforms can trigger relooking at government scales and interfaces. And so finally, in conclusion, means we believe that if we look at illuminating formal, informal categories, enabling legal reforms and urban resilience in integrated planning, we might have a better recovery from a more long-term, better recovery from what we saw as data coming out of the first pandemic. Thank you very much, Shomadip. I hope I was on time.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Dasgupta, for your very interesting and comprehensive presentation. Like, it almost touched upon almost all the issues which are relevant in this post-pandemic scenario, and you have already discussed in detail the sorts of enablers and obstacles to a more sort of resilient and sustainable city emerging from this COVID-19 pandemic. And you have presented different policy options for dealing with these pandemic situations, as well as the mitigation and preparedness for future disasters in the long run prevention. And just to mention some of them, like you mentioned about the adoption of an integrated planning approach, the clear separation of what markets in Indian cities. You emphasized on for adequate investment to improve the public healthcare system, ensuring the urban services are interrupted, equally accessible for the urban poor. And also you mentioned about the importance of the social security scheme, as well as ensuring their access to the people who are most vulnerable. And another interesting point you mentioned about this, apart from the traditional argument of or conventional argument of empowering local government, you also emphasized on the importance of the engagement with the fourth tier of government, for example, via the community-based organizations, self-help groups, slum dwellers, as you mentioned, happened in the case of Odisha. So, and also you also alluded to the importance of revisiting the Disaster Management Act with a broader aim to incorporate the city governments in any public health emergency related legislation. So thank you very much for your presentation and all these things. And now may I now request our chair, Professor Santosh Mehrotra, to share your comments, sir, on Dr. Dasgupta's presentation. It's over to you, sir. Please unmute yourself.
Right. No, I was trying to and I was failing. Shomiti, it might be just better to hear the experts, and I would honestly prefer that we hear all the discussants
Okay, sir.
And then I come in at the end. It's a much better utilization of time, honestly.
Okay, sir, no problem. So then I now request Professor Sauvanic Roy, if you, sir, please share your comments on today's lecture or presentation.
Yeah. Good evening. And am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Shomadip, for inviting me. And thank you, Dr. Shubhagato, for such a insightful study in reimagining the urban governance future, informed through the lessons of the pandemic. In fact, there is nothing to really differ. I just like to flag 2-3 issues, and maybe I'll be asking one kind of one point which you may like to elaborate. So, which in our we have done some study on the kind of the spread of the pandemic in the global south, and in that what we found that the density issue was a big question. But what we found is and there is a big difference between density and overcrowding. Means if it's a planned density, it's a high density can work even very well. But if it's an unplanned overcrowding, then even at a lower density, then the situation becomes really alarming and worse. And that happened both in US, like Manhattan, even with a higher density out of the 5 boroughs of Manhattan, Manhattan with a higher density had a lesser infection, the caseloads than Brooklyn and Queens. So, which is more with the Latin and the Black people live. So that is there's a relation between the spread of the pandemic and with the pre-existing inadequacy in terms of access to various kind of facilities, including the public open space. So this is one point probably which is important to look into, that the relation between the building typology, the multi-storied living, and how it varies across different social sections to have a very different kind of result. And with the same typology work may well with in a planned situation, whereas completely different result in an unplanned situation. The second point is in the multi-storied living, the lifts, like you have mentioned rightly, the wet markets are major super spreaders. And what is found also that when the public transport is one of the major area of spread, and where the social distancing or health and hygiene protocols are not maintained. Similarly, the vertical circulation codes, particularly the lift, the size of lifts and all. So that has really, and the location of the core and the size of the circulation code. So the relation of the sellable area versus the circulation area, these kind of relations are very important. That is all about the building typology. Second point which I like to highlight is, which has not been discussed in case of many of the slums. I'm forgetting the name in the Rio slum, but Dharavi, what has been highlighted, that community networks really did the most, I should say, what was unexpected. Because there was a discussion at one point of time whether Dharavi to be abandoned and demolished even during the pandemic of in the initial 6 months when there were reports of death. But finally, what was found that the various kind of community structures, the physical structures like the schools, the Anganwadi centers, the physical and the social network in the community in terms of the kind of Anganwadi workers and the other frontline workers, what you have mentioned, the sanitation workers. So local resources, both the physical resources and the soft skill, the human resources, if they can really join together, probably we have the right kind of answer to these kind of place-based spread or the stopping the spread. So obviously what comes out is that the nexus which you rightly pointed out, that our discussion as planners mostly revolve around housing, sanitation, means the public health and open space. But probably the public health is the really neglected area. And when we talk about public health, it has like poverty, it has multiple dimensions. Sometimes we think about public health only in terms of the physical infrastructure, but actually open space is also a dimension of the public health. So probably all these multiple dimensions, if they are clear, then how these are, even in a very resource constrained situation, how this can help. So instead of very focused or single use infrastructure, if we have a lot of idle assets in our cities, like the idle buildings, housing stock in our cities. And probably in the last first 6 months, many of the shopping malls and multi-story buildings were just remain vacant. So if we can repurpose these existing infrastructure, and we have a lot of these in our cities, which are actually more of speculative thing and single use infrastructure. So really there is a need to look into more like a contextual view of the existing infrastructure and how we can repurpose it in the time of such disasters or pandemics, particularly in a very high density and large number of vulnerable communities which the cities have. So the repurposing of the existing infrastructure is very important. Yeah, these are the issues. And finally, I went through the very elaborate summary of your report. Probably we really need to question the kind of post-globalization narrative of city as engines of economic growth. I think we need to completely reorient this single narrative of engines of economic growth towards more as a combination of economic well-being and social cohesion. So if we change that narrative from a growth-driven to a more social, society-driven perspective, then probably we can really come out with a model which is more appropriate for Global South and the kind of infrastructure what we have already built upon to really make our cities resilient. So yeah, that's my point. And also I have just one question, or I should not say question, that maybe a kind of, I'm also asking myself that such a elaborate study and so many studies have been done. So what should be the entry point? So means we are talking about integrated approaches, integrated planning, and existing assets reutilization. So what would be the entry point? Because we know that we have smart cities and we have the smart city plans, city development plans. On the other hand, we have the master plans in our cities, and hardly 25% of our cities have master plans, and even 10% out of those which are met, say, I think out of 4,000 cities or 8,000, including non-statutory towns, probably not more than 1,200 have master plans. Even within the master plans, probably 40% only the master plan recommendations are implementing. So you said one of the entry point is certainly the command and control centers, where we can really take the help of monitoring and surveillance, contract tracing and all. But I was just wondering that the cities which do not have master plans, can we have some kind of an entry point through which such a well-researched study and other studies which have been done? Because you rightly pointed out that the bridging the gap between formal and informal. If we take that, the cities which have master plans and which do not have master plans, how to bridge that gap? So probably that's I do not have the answer. So I was just wondering if this panel can throw some light on that. What would be the entry points and how to start really go for an incremental resilience rather than what we see in case of completely new towns where we can plan in anticipation of these pandemics. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Roy, for all your comments and things. Now let me just add one point, which is already related to what Professor Roy has said. Like as he mentioned, like there are serious misconceptions regarding the correlation between COVID-19 and the compact urban development, and in fact this can encourage the de-densification, what is actually happening now. Although there is no evidence to suggest that density per se correlates to higher transmission. Now these perceived effects of density on COVID-19 are in fact, as Professor Roy was also mentioning, that as a result of certain other factors like overcrowding, unequal access to services, and so on. So my question would be to something like that. It is important to prevent urban de-densification in response to COVID-19. And in that case, how should we reframe our urban planning rhetoric? So this is my question now, since this is relevant to what Professor Roy has mentioned. So just I'm placing my question here. So and now let me, may I now request our other panelist, Mr. Tikender Panwar, to share his views on today's presentation. Can you hear us?
Yeah, thank you. Am I also audible?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Shubhagato. I think it's a fascinating study and probably quite extensive as well. So I think I will speak from the perspective of the city, and especially when in the conclusion, what they have mentioned is way forward. I mean that systemic challenges that urban governance in India will need to address in the future. I 100% agree with that. But I think what Professor Santosh Mehrotra also pointed out, I think I'll just make a passing reference to that. For the simple reason, what we have been arguing, this pandemic and the way we have been building our cities also shows a very interesting dialect between city planning and the way pandemic spreads. And this goes back to the basic structure and the framework of neoliberal capitalism in which we are living in. And the driving force for the present system, and that's why when he said systemic crisis, I think I must mention a part, because I have served the city for 5 years, and let me tell you, the driving force for the town had and was always been, and with the smart cities again comes to focus, is competitive cities, where cities are considered as entrepreneurs. And this what I've been reiterating time and again, though I'll make just a passing reference to that, but I'm really fascinated to what John Ploss in Habitat 3 said, that, hey, look, we have to actually revisit the way we are planning our cities. This whole business of laissez-faire, a free market economy governing the cities, and in which profit happens to be the guiding force, and public health becomes one of the major victims. And this is what we've seen all over. Even when there's high spending on health, and it's not on public health, we've seen how this health system has crumbled badly, not only in the global south, but also in the global north. So I think when we speak about systemic issues, I don't know what we can do about that, but I think those are certain structural issues, structural frameworks that we need to ponder over it. I mean, and therefore I bring John Ploss back. We said we have to go back to the basics and the basics of planning. Now, how that is to be done, how and what Samuel Stein has been writing. There is interesting work that is, of course, that came before the pandemic, the real estate state, the capital city, where he points out, we planners are not corrupt, but the system makes us corrupt, and then we actually, so we also fall in line the way the system works. So having said that, I think we just cannot bypass that, and that has to be that has to be one of the discourse. I mean, minus the smart cities. I mean, for heaven's sake, Surat City Resilience Index, very top. Now they're burning dead bodies in the open. They were considered to be the resilient cities of our town, and day one, your migrant workers started walking back. So what is it? What is it that we are? And they are part of those smart cities, and they said we'll have command centers. So this whole bogey of ideas that once you have technology, scientific temperament, science and technology going together, we'll just get rid of it. That has not happened actually. It has. So I think I'll park it there. I think that is something. So three important issues what have been pointing out by various experts, but I think I would like to reiterate here. It's one, that's degradation of a public health institutional framework. How do we address that? Two, the whole question of physical connectivity, what you have been pointing out. What are the challenges? How do we actually work? And destruction of the natural ecosystems. Come on, we have to really bring also that also to the fore, particularly our forests, and the kind of changes that we are bringing out even in our country on the environment impact assessment. So that makes the whole question of urban commons, that also increases the vulnerability. But that leads me to the point that I want to make, and that what has also been stressed upon about bringing city to focus and revisiting disaster risk reduction strategies. So Dr. Shubhagato must be knowing that, we have this central framework. So we could see the Prime Minister, we could see the Chief Minister, so the PM, CM and the DM, the city mayor and the city council was completely out from the whole crisis of mitigating the pandemic or the challenges that we have. Why is it so? So we have the national, the NDMA, National Disaster Management Plan of Action. We have the State Disaster Management Plan of Action. We have the DDMAs, but I think that is what we have to point out. The CDMAs are also there, the City Disaster Management Plan of Action. And when we were in Shimla, I think we were able to create a city atlas where we were able to measure the vulnerabilities down to the ward level. And what we call, it's an acronym called BOARE. BOARE is a very it's a mountain dialect word. Boare means, where the community participates together for tilling, sowing, for harvesting and all. But it was an acronym for building urban adaptation for resilience in emergencies. That's what we could map that. But the funniest part is the CDMA was created. Since it's not ratified, it licks the dustbin. It licks some shelf. So I think it is high time that we have to revisit our disaster risk reduction strategies, apart from the structural issues that I have mentioned. So empowering the cities, not just the city mayors, but the city councils and the people per se. So going back, and I think this also defeats the whole logic of profitability, because if people are brought to the fore, they are prioritized, I think then this whole idea of democratizing the surplus and probably adapting the people to be more adapted to fight the pandemic would also come to. And here I suggest two important things, probably which may sound too utopian, but I think nevertheless I would still, and with that I would end. The first thing is, I think it's been maybe I think 3 decades when we had the first urban commission, and Charles Correa, we all know, was the chair of that urban commission. We have one lone surviving member, Kirti Bhai. So that came from our informal discussions. So I think it is high time that we actually bring this urban commission at the national level, because the hell lot of changes have taken place. A lot of changes have not just taken place on the way this urbanization has to unfold, but also the way the family units and structures have changed. The complete paradigm shift what it was 3 decades ago. So how do we negotiate it? When you speak about density, so it's complete paradigm shift. I think that's what is important and very, very desperately required. The second thing, which I think, which we former city representatives or even the present ones, though that's a risky field, is that I think we require definitely a fourth list. We have the union list, the state list, the concurrent list. I think we desperately require a fourth list called the local bodies list. For the simple reason, it's not clear. It's completely ambiguous, despite the 74th constitutional amendment that we have. Still, and I think IMPRI is one of IMPRI has done some brilliant studies on that. CPR has done lots of work on that. Out of the 18 subjects under the 12th schedule, I think not more than 3 or 4 are commonly actually passed on to the city government. This won't do. This is not the system. Neither it's a sustainable way in the meta economic sense that we're talking about, nor is it in the governance model that we're talking about. Somewhere you have transport, in other places you have water. Actually, who is running the city? That's what we need to ask. It's not the people, not the council. It's a parastatal organization. Delhi is the Delhi Development Authority, Mumbai Development Authorities. Can we sustain our cities by that? I mean, the Delhi Development Authorities give a damn to even the chief minister, who I call the metropolitan mayor of Delhi for that matter, and for likely Mumbai. So how do we? So I think that 4th schedule. And I remember Deepak Sanan, who was one of our urban development secretaries in Himachal Pradesh, is a retired bureaucrat, probably, and he brought in some of very interesting amendments to the present act, whereby he said land will be an important asset to with the local bodies, and they will not be able to part land even if they want to give it to the government. The government will have to come as a bidder. So that asset holding capacity of the cities and the city governments, I think that's very important. So yeah, not to just repeat what Professor Mehrotra was saying, we have the Oxfam report, we have the Gini coefficient. I mean, it's completely unsustainable. Yesterday, day before yesterday, we've seen pictures and pictures coming out, not just bodies being burned, but also our migrant people going back to where they come from the countryside. This is not a sustainable model. So I think definitely that's a fascinating study, and it will give more teeth and armor to all those forces who are actually trying to negotiate a way and trying to build up some alternate paradigm of. I mean, for us, I don't think that this is a sustainable way. So thank you. I think that.
So thank you, Mr. Panwar. It's always nice to hear you and your provocative thoughts and all these things. So yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned about this, the importance of another National Commission on Urbanization, especially the importance of a local body list for the local governance, because we talk many things about the empowerment of the local bodies, but there are 2 important lacunae. One is local bodies do not know what is their functional domain, and unless and until they do not know what they are entrusted with, it is not possible for them to look for the funds to arrange and to finance those functional responsibilities. So it's a very much valid point, and I'm sure Dr. Dasgupta will elaborate a lot on respond to these fundamental issues or fundamental questions. So thank you once again for your comments. So let me now request our next panelist, Mrs. Saili Manikkar, for your comments. It's over to you, Mrs. Saili. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
You can, right?
Okay.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. I'm Saili. I'm a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation and the urban lead here. Firstly, let me congratulate Dr. Dasgupta and his entire team for putting up a report that was so comprehensive. I went through the summary that was provided to me and also through your presentation. So I'll be reflecting more on what I have read and heard from you. To begin with, I think we all have come to a very interesting conclusion, and a very definitive one, that peripheral issues will now become central post-COVID in urban planning and governance. And that's the given. So I think that is why we are talking so much of inclusivity and slums and all of this. I'm going to talk a little on 2 issues. To begin with, the first would be slums. And this comes from my experience of course, being a Mumbaikar, but also someone who studied slums for over 15 years, mainly in Mumbai, Thane, and Nagpur and Pune, which are the top 10 cities, are amongst the 4 top 10 cities of India, which have slums. So I would say that I completely agree with the kind of statistics you have thrown up, which is regularly reported. But I think what remains is, and I think few panelists really brought it up, is I think there is a great need to redefine slums and the settlements within. And now is probably the time we could do that and use a pandemic for that. So the first thing I think is we cannot look at slums purely as informal settlements. So we have to distinguish between the very poor, the poor, and the informal, definitely, because the requirements of all of them are very, very different, and their environmental conditions, their social conditions of people staying there are very different. So for example, like I've been writing on Dharavi for 1 year now, especially with respect to COVID and the pandemic, and it would be really unfair to really just put it in the bracket of a slum, knowing that there are 6-7 different kind of settlements within, and what are the requirements of those different settlements. And there is no study on where are the infections really. Are they in the informal areas, or are they in the areas which have no provisions at all? So we have to, this is a very good time where we can define on or rework on definitions. So I think as urbanists, that this is a very good time to propose reworking on definitions. Secondly, I have seen that, of course, I'm very happy that this study hasn't done it, but very often when urbanists talk about slums, it's typically about housing. And therefore, I think that is not an approach we should take. And there are multiple inclusions when we talk of slums, whether there are environmental elements, social elements, economic elements. They need to definitely come out. The requirement of a slum in terms of all these, and the trilateral approach that we should have. So that should definitely come out. Also, I think within a slum, because we are talking of migrants, again, we should, the construction worker has a different requirement, house worker has a different requirement, someone who is probably doing work in, say, small scale units has a different requirement. So how do we again put the requirements of these different I would say units in the whole slum narrative is what we should definitely bring in. So one, I thought definitions are very important, and it's a very interesting time to use this time to redefine. Because I'll give you an example. So for like 2 days ago, the Chief Minister of Maharashtra made some announcements of giving out grains to certain people, money to certain people. So it was like defined as construction workers should be given some money, hawkers have to be given some money, people in slums per head should be given some grains. Now, on what basis was this decided? So if we have better definitions, I think the distribution of social welfare could happen better. So that was my rationale behind bringing up this one issue. The second issue, which I thought maybe it could be a part of your larger paper, but which was absent in the summary, was the issue of city financing. And I think this is very, very crucial. Today, when property tax is the only, really the only city finance stream that is really left, and with, this year has been particularly bad with with many cities not being able to even cover 50% of their property tax money that comes in, funds that come in. It's a big question, right? That where is the money going to come from, really? So I think it's time that so from the inclusion point of view, I would like to bring in the 74th Amendment here. And so if you look at the 74th Amendment very closely in terms of the inclusion and urban poor, it talks about 18 functions of the city, right? And out of which urban poverty redressal, social and economic development, welfare, and poor sections are a part of city functions. But if you look at the budgets, there are no budgets alongside these functions. So you ask a city to really conduct these functions, but you don't give them money for it, or there are no monies alongside it. So there is always going to be a disparity. So how is it time that we revisit the 74th Amendment? And I mean, many of us will agree that the devolution has really not happened in the true sense. Do cities really have the kind of power that they should? In fact, the speaker before me, Tikender Panwar, actually brought out an interesting point of parastatals. I think that's one way in which, we are trying to dodge, like a development authority really is a way in which we try to dodge the urban local body and try to get things done. So where is the space, or where is the, where does a urban local body really find itself in this whole thing? In fact, in the pandemic, the entire task of looking after the pandemic, whether it was the health part, the social part, everything rested on the urban local bodies. But where were the funds, or what kind of devolution have you done? So I think these are larger questions that definitely need to come in when we are of funding. And therefore, is it a time to talk about private finance and new types of funding that are coming in? Because we've seen that bonds haven't worked in many cities. I mean, we've had multiple bonds that have been really rolled out. So is bonds the way? Is impact financing the way? Is private financing the way after all? I don't know. So maybe it's a good time to even bring in the finance part of it. And I would like to share. So I've shared with all of you on the chat a paper that I've done on spatial planning and assessing COVID, the public health aspect of COVID through spatial planning. So I've taken the example of Mumbai and looked at the 2034 DP that has come out, the 2014-34 DP, and looked at the other DPs also that got rolled out from the time spatial planning started in Mumbai. So what we really found is that, I have shared the paper, so I would be happy to even get feedback on it. But I think the point that you raised, Dr. Dasgupta, in your paper of, dynamic planning, multi-level or integrated approach, I think we need to really move at it fast. Because to give you a small example, right now, public health, why should the entire load of public health really lie on a ULB? In case of probably a city like Mumbai, it's taking the load of public health. Is public health purely, is it actually the function of a ULB? I mean, we need to ask, or is only primary health the function of a ULB? Is there a need to divide public health into multi-level governance? Like the central government take care of some of it, the state some of it, and the ULB some of it. So there are so many things that we need to think about from the pandemic point of view in case of spatial planning. So I have raised some of those points in my paper, but overall, really good study, and I look forward to your larger paper. Thank you very much.
So, thank you, Sarli, and for raising some important issues. For example, you mentioned about the importance of redefining the slums and the settlements within, and acknowledge the differences in the requirements of different settlements. And these comes to us to the larger question of the importance of the systematic, reliable, and robust urban data and statistics. So really we need data at the disaggregated, even at the most local level, and disaggregate maybe by sex, age, caste, at all disaggregated level that is possible for us. So we need data which is robust at the same time as well as systematic. And also you mentioned about an important aspect of the financial health of the cities. And yeah, I was just looking at one of the recent reports by the World Bank. It is estimated that the local government revenue will be 50 to 20% lower in 2021 due to this COVID-19, and which would undoubtedly further undermine the public service delivery, the infrastructure investment, and the sustainable urban development. So definitely we need to think of the possible policy options to enhance the local government budgetary capacity. And because the conventional revenue instruments are unlikely to be effective, because now we need to take into account also the need to prevent any additional financial pressure on the poorer and the most vulnerable groups residing in the cities. So I'm sure that Dr. Dasgupta will reflect a lot on these issues while in his response. So now,
Dr. Chattopadhyay, just one little thing, because just one little thing which I forgot to mention.
Yeah, please.
Dr. Dasgupta, just because so I used to be a journalist. I was in the Indian Express covering infrastructure and urban policy for 14 years before I became a researcher. Past 6 years, I've been a researcher. So just to give you a very interesting example of how the press really doesn't study much, because your study is based on the whole thing of press and media, you will very typically read that the press keeps referring to Mumbai as the richest corporation in Asia. It is not. In fact, we've done a paper and we've written about this over and over again, that the Mumbai corporation is actually in the red today. It has dipped into its reserves to really run itself. Like last year was the first year it had to dip into its reserves. So many a times I don't know whether it is lack of transparency or lack of the kind of need to deep dwell into issues, but there is misrepresentation also that happens in media, and there are market forces also which drive a lot of things that comes into media. So just that little comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So now may I request our next panelist, Mr. Samir Unale.
Yes, Samir sir is here.
Yes. So are you here, sir?
Yes, very good evening.
Good evening. Yes.
Yeah. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are audible.
And I think this has been a very interesting session. We must congratulate sir for documenting this, because documentation is required, and especially in scenarios in which it's almost like emergency scene and a disaster scene. Most of the machinery is so deeply involved in firefighting and reacting and taking actions that the documentation part very often is left behind. So I think this was a very good effort done, and I hope this effort is also replicated in other states also and other cities also, in which the experiences that we are flashing by us are documented, and there is some study and trends are analyzed and lessons are learned on how to respond to such a situation. I will focus more on the topic of governance and COVID. I would be taking COVID as more as a biological disaster, an epidemic as a biological disaster, and how would be a government responding to that. When we talk of governance, it's of course the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, and of course the fourth estate now. As far as the legislative framework is concerned, I believe, the first Epidemic Act is of 1897. So I think there is no legislative vacuum, so to say. And of course, the second Disaster Management Act that we have, and other ancillary provisions which exist in the Criminal Procedure Code and the Indian Penal Code. So I believe the broader legislative framework of dealing of such pandemics and epidemics was in place in India. And I think it has helped to work on such disasters. I think second, of course, was the executive part, which is more into the actual running of disaster recovery measures that are taken. Broader issues, of course, have been dealt very well. But I think what I found was that the mid-level functionaries of municipal corporations are the real unit leaders now into the fight against COVID. So the political leadership, of course, is there. The city leadership, the responses and experiences are varied. Some councillors are very active, some mayors are very active, sometimes they are not. And the actual efficiency, the actual performance of a city, when you talk at the very grassroots level, really depends upon this mid-level functionaries of the medical officers, maybe the deputy or executive engineers, the ward officers, the Vasuli clerk, and the sanitary inspector. So these are the people who are really leading the exact hand-to-hand battle, as one might say, the hand-to-hand combat with COVID. And actually, this segment really came to foremost. And I might just share that in Maharashtra, I think apart probably from Rajasthan, we have created a statewide cadres of this mid-level functionaries for the councils. It can go both way, but a well-trained and politically independent bureaucracy is also a factor which can improve the probable efficiency of a city government, as well as especially in disaster situations, because the essence is time here. I mean, just to share with you, I think we were 3,030 days back, and now we are 60,000 a day approximately. So the speed with which things move, the traditional way of bureaucratic functioning very often becomes, irrelevant. By the time you take your review meeting and issue a circular, the things on ground have changed by the time the people interact. So that's where I feel the technology element can help and aid facing situations which the cities are facing. I think when it goes beyond a particular scale, you cannot use clerks writing down the paper and making the reports and sending it by post. The managing data on the dynamic scale using technology very feasible to respond to cases on a real-time basis. And third fact I wanted to share is that, of course, Saili also, ma'am also mentioned on the role of media and the report they make. Of course, no one has guts to be critical against media these days, so definitely not us. But I do feel that the media has been grossly irresponsible in the way they have reported the entire COVID issue. And in fact, when I was early working in a place, I had thought of issuing a notice under Disaster Management Act and IPC, but I was told not to do that and just let go a normal request of reporting properly, because media or news business is now an entertainment business. They want to run it like a reality show. And like they say in quantum mechanics, when you observe, you change. So is the case now. The report and the things change, or they change to report, or whatever the case. I'm sorry about being critical about media, but the experience of what I have seen, the way papers are coming, I mean, it has been well below par, and on the contrary, absence has been generated out of that. But well, that is everyone has limitations, and probably so does media here, and we have to go along with everything. Third aspect, I think, was the mass hysteria, element of mass hysteria and the administrative responses hysterias. Of course, there have been certain indications that there has to be proper reporting, and in fact, all the levels of government are coming with daily news releases every day. In fact, on the cases of on the situation of this thing, but the administration is legal, rational, and by and large, global south are emotional. So the responses is very much, they tend to respond in a very emotional way, and that at mass scale translates into mass hysterias and such scenes. And handling that at local level is indeed a challenge. It's a new element and aspect of an administration that has come up as to how to respond to people when they are behaving in a hysteria. I'm not accusing anybody, but the on ground the scene is that if the slightest news comes out, it is spread on social media, and you will find people extremely panic and running around here and there. So a new mechanism of mass hysteria on real time, on social media, on whichever way, is a new lesson that has to be learned, and probably some best practice will be documented and also circulated. Regarding generally, I mean, lastly, I would like to talk of public health and cities. Surprisingly, of course, it's almost a cliche. When we talk of cities, we talk of the Harappan cities and how well planned they were, and how well the hydraulics engineering was so fantastic, and all those things. But somewhere down the line, we probably have to run that again and come down to taking concrete and credible actions and steps that will be relevant to the people actually. So I mean, regarding and lastly, after this mass hysteria thing, I've always felt that public was somehow not the focus of cities, and somewhere we went on more for the cement and infrastructure and maybe digital and those things, which of course are required, but some focus on public health is also crucial. Maybe in urban, in rural areas, you always had the primary health centers. So I think some governments in some states have taken steps which are getting replicated, offering maybe more clinic or small, basti clinics which have come up, and at least the medium initial levels taken care of. We do have urban health missions also, but I hope in the coming days, focus on public health gets improved, and maybe some dedicated source of revenue is attached to that, so that the budgetary issues are not limit to the objectives of general public health. Overall, the social stratification that we have in our society, the economic various stages and income we have, that I think is what will always, these features come up more prominently in case of such emergency or disaster or scenarios when they come up. And handling them and tackling them requires proper training of middle functionaries. I think I am told there is a new national now set up, especially and of government machinery. And I hope that this measure should help in training the mid-level city functions to better level, and they are necessary resources and powers to deal with these kind of scenarios. I think one point was made by our by Pamarji regarding the Disaster Management Act and the role of city government in that. I think that was a very valid point, that very often the disaster, we still, the institution of district magistrate is so fancied in India, despite 250 years old now. And probably we have moved into urban India, and the role of district magistrate has, in my view, lost the earlier significance which is had. And I think the municipal commissioner probably has more role in urban area than the district collector, but yet this framework is to be fully comprehended and converted into the necessary legislative empowerment which has to be done of the municipal commission. So in fact, in a city like Mumbai, the district magistrate per se has no role. As the running of the city is essentially the municipal commissioner as the police commissioner, and so is the case system that we have in Maharashtra. I think more states are also now adopting this system. So I think the Disaster Management Act talks of the district magistrate and the as the linchpin or the fulcrum of the entire disaster management activity in the city. I think that needs to be revisited. In urban areas, it is the municipal commissioner who is leading the city, and he needs to be brought into the framework of Disaster Management Act. And whatever powers have been given to district magistrate in the city, in the district, the similar powers needs to be given to the municipal commissioner in the urban areas for these people who react. Otherwise, there is an issue of, the municipal commissioner is senior to district magistrate, and then he is still heading the, such issues all over the country. There might be such, instances which might be coming up. So by and large, I think this is a very good effort done of documentation. In fact, such documentation should be done even at the international level and shared to each other. In fact, I must share that we tried to, some of our friends tried to create international and as a sort of network in American cities and Asian cities and East Asian cities. And we will surprise at the commonalities of the issues we found that most of them faced vis-a-vis COVID. So I think there's greater scope, I believe, for such international cooperations among the cities, and especially the mid-level functionaries of the cities, in which there could be more documentation, more sharing of best practices, and maybe they could lead to some greater efficiencies and effectivities. Ultimately, the entire city urban system, so to say, has to survive and function for better services to the citizens. Citizens should take pride in the city, and they should be served by the stakeholders which are running the city. And for that issues, the community in any administrative aspect has to be strengthened more. Right now, it is left to maybe some society, some institutions working under the Societies Act, maybe some community-based organization. But still, it is, I think, that this feeling of patronage and feeling of holier than thou of either the bureaucracy or the political leadership, all the people who supposedly run this institution is there. So I think the community-based organizations in India will also have to evolve, mature, to play the role which they claim they are doing. Otherwise, it is sometimes, I am not saying in every case, but sometimes the supposed functions and what they actually do not some match. So how can we organize, institutionalize the role of community-based organizations into administrative setup of a city? Needs also to be, that's a new challenge or new opportunity that we have that we should learn on making the community also equal partner in running the city, especially in such emergency scenarios. So that I believe is more important, because a city municipality or a city government is not more than 0.5% of city's population, and if we expect that 0.5% to take care of the remaining 9.5%, then that always certain issues will be there. So you would be requiring more community engagement at the institutional level and also at direct personal level. So another innovation in administration of such emergency scenarios, I feel, is to create greater communication on one-to-one basis with each and every citizen. And that's where I believe, again, probably technology can help, because earlier when I was working as CEO for a smart city, we had tried to create a city app in which we have 3 lakh registered users in this, and the engagement on the app is, you won't believe, it's above 50 million or 5 crore engagements happen in last maybe 7 to 8 months, post COVID, should I say that. So I think the very magnitude, the number of the population, the magnitude of issues is such that we will have to move from the traditional framework of administration to more flexible, more connected, more community oriented, more technology driven, and more collaborative form of administrative processes and institutions would be required to, that's a lesson I think that we'll have to learn, because we can't forget these times, and that has to be put into some proper use by proper documentation. And that's why I was very impressed by the effort done by CPR on these grounds, and I hope this documentation is done more in other cities and states also. And I think that was my general reflections, and very honestly, I couldn't really prepare myself be more organized while discussing. More of the reflections of as an individual on what could how could act as a governance, as an administrative framework can learn from this COVID times. In fact, there was a sanitary commissioner for India, and he used to give yearly reports. And even if you search the net, you will find the report of sanitary commissioner for India, and his report of 1919 is almost 600 pages. Then he really goes through, at various, what were the various types of diseases, what was the response of then Spanish flu, then we had 100 years back. And so, of course, we are much, much better. You will be surprised. It talks of 7% of India's population died in the 1918 Spanish flu. It was so disastrous, but some of our historians and history people never taught that British disaster that happened in India. It was 100 times worse than, or 1,000 or lakh times worse than Jallianwala Bagh, but not a single NCRT or any book really told us that this was the Spanish flu disaster, and we forgot the lessons of Spanish flu. Unfortunately, I must be saying that. And in that generations didn't knew that it happened. It was reported in oral traditions that's plague. In fact, I remember because my grandfather also was in Mumbai, and I was told by my grandmother that he was under plague. I was wondering when was the plague in India in 1918. But apart from that, what I'm saying, that let us not miss this lessons here. Let's document it. Let's train it. Let it get institutionalized. Not only the administrative framework, but also in the general city memory or social memory, that in these times, these were the steps were taken, and this had to be fought, and what it took to fight, and the loss we had to go through, that should also be a part of the oral traditions and the history of the city, which as such is not a very strong measure here. Maybe some old cities have a history written for that city, or collect that the city government really takes pains to find out what is the history of the city for that matter. So I'm sorry, probably a bit harsh on sometimes, but probably I was reflecting and in my individual capacity on the issues I felt right now as we are into the midst of the bigger second wave, and in the Maharashtra is probably gateway of India. So we are always 2 to 3 months ahead of the other cities on the curve. So probably a lot of lessons that we are learning, other states should also, maybe the city governments there can take a cue and start preparing and building up for that. So thank you very much for the opportunity of sharing some of my personal thoughts on. Thank you.
Thank you, Saumit, for sharing some critical views on this current pandemic situation. And as you rightly mentioned, from being administrative point of view, like we need to take the help of technology in dealing with this pandemic situation, which is changing quite rapidly. And also you broadly alluded to the question of improving capacity of the government organs dealing with this pandemic situation. At the same time, you warned about the possible pitfalls of allowing the local government to engage with the community-based organizations, because as far as the experiences of this kind of collaborations are concerned, the evidences are mixed. Like, although Dr. Dasgupta has mentioned about some positive results about, or the positive experiences of this Jaga mission and the Odisha experiences, but there are certain other, but definitely we can learn from those experiences, and it is the high time that we should retrospect and reflect on all those success and failure stories. So with this, I think we have already gathered a lot of different viewpoints. Our panelists have already raised and discussed some of the important issues. So may I now request our chair, Professor Mehrotra sir, to share your comments, or
yes, indeed. I was
okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Thank you. In fact, I'm glad that you're giving me a chance to speak now, so that perhaps I might be able to elicit some responses from Professor Dasgupta. So first of all, it's been an enormously learning experience for me. So thank you very much for having me here in the first place. But I want to make 3 sets of points which resonate with me very, very deeply. Let me begin with an issue which I think has not really come up with, but which is central in a sense to the problems that our cities face. And that is the following: that our cities have, typically developed horizontally rather than vertically. They have emerged as urban sprawls, and urban sprawl has gone alongside unplanned, congested slums emerging. By contrast, the most livable cities are actually very dense cities, and they develop vertically rather than horizontally. And this is part of the problem with our city's ability and the city's administration's ability, which our municipal commissioner was rightly pointing to, of being able to handle a pandemic like this. And I was utterly stunned to hear what Professor Roy told us, that only 25% of our cities have master plans. And on top of that, he said that only 40% of the recommendations from the master plans are actually implemented. So this is where this is our starting point. How do we even expect a poor municipal commissioner to handle this kind of situation? This is point 1. My second point is actually in response to what Saili said about how do we make our cities more inclusive. Well, it's not that we don't actually have the database for doing that. How to identify the poor in the cities is something that was done towards the end of the UPA in what is today called the Socioeconomic and Caste Census, and it incorporated the cities. And if anyone's interested, you can have a look at a chapter of my book in Seizing the Demographic Dividend Policies to Achieve Inclusive Growth in India. It's by Cambridge. It's published by Cambridge University Press in 2016. So it's not that difficult to actually identify the poor and reach and ensure that basic services are actually made available to them. That was my very brief second point. But my third point is actually a much bigger one. And that goes to the heart of many of the things that Mr. Panwar said, that Saili said, and the municipal commissioner also said. And, what we are seeing, I was really struck by what Panwar said about the fact that what we are seeing is the predominance of the PM, CM, DM mode of implementation of everything. What we are seeing, in other words, is the opposite of what the experts on this panel were in a sense implying repeatedly, which is that this is a vast country which has thousands of cities, and the only way you will govern this country is through a decentralized mechanism, and a deep democratic decentralization needs to happen. What we are seeing happen is the opposite of that. And I was particularly, noticing the fact that Mr. Panwar pointed out that while the constitutional amendments of the early 90s said, 18 subjects were to be passed on to the ULBs, only 3, and even those 3 have been passed on by the state governments in a very differentiated manner. The same thing applies to the PRIs in the rural areas. 29 subjects were to be passed on, and definitely most of those have not been passed on by the state governments. Now, in this context, and this point was made that our cities are bankrupt. They just don't have the money. It was repeatedly made by you. Well, then, shouldn't we be asking the question, why isn't the 14th Finance Commission or the 15th Finance Commission taking more serious note of this? And I would say to all of you who work in this space to literally go to town on this subject, that the 15th Finance Commission is not even enabling our cities to actually generate the tax revenues, to have the budget to actually do the expenditure that we would all like to see happen. On this, I'd like to sort of just dwell a few minutes on how centralized our system of governance is compared to, guess which country? China. We are the electoral democracy, they are a one-party state. We know this. We are the federal democracy, they have a unitary constitution. Right? But remarkably, China is more fiscally decentralized than India is more fiscally decentralized. I want to emphasize this. And it would shock most of you to know that in China, roughly 54% of all public expenditure conducted by all levels of government, meaning central, provincial, and local taken together. If you take that as the denominator of that total public expenditure of the governments of China, 54% is done by the local governments, meaning township and county governments. What is the comparable share in our country? 5% or less. What is the share of total revenues that are collected in China by the township and county governments as a proportion of all revenues collected? It's 24%. In our country, it's less than 1%. Why should we be then surprised that ours is a highly fiscally centralized system, despite being an electoral democracy, despite being a federal democracy? And in fact, I won't go too far into this discussion, but there is a body of literature which has demonstrated that one of the reasons why China has sustained such phenomenal GDP growth and therefore also ensured equality, elimination of poverty, is precisely because of the competition between the township and county governments in both generating investment, which actually enabled them to generate tax revenues, which they could retain because Beijing allowed them to retain the additional tax revenues. What do we have? The exact opposite. So let me stop there and I think hand it back to you, Dr. Chattopadhyay. And
thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for making some provocative comments and some more insights into this entire discussion. So without wasting much time, now let me straight go back to Professor Dr. Dasgupta for your responses to all the issues, all the questions, all the comments which have been discussed here so far. It's over to you, Dr. Dasgupta. It's already a hell lot of issues, I think, we have
Yes.
to address.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for all these comments. I am delighted that we are having this discussion. I'm so delighted that some of the core structural issues that define what we understand as urban, or what is the lived experience of urban in India, is being open to be critiqued and to be understood better. I'm super delighted for that. I would love to have some sort of mechanism, Arjun, maybe to continue some of these discussions that we are having today, because they are wide and quite deep, and we need to understand from each other, as well as the nuanced differences, while all of us are broadly on the same page on the whole range of issues, from decentralization to the limits of neoliberal urbanization, and across the environment to let's say densities in urban planning. While we all of us on this panel, I think, share some of our positions around this, understanding the nuances that each one has on why the situation is such, and what it might take to entail, as Professor Roy said, entry points for taking this forward. It might be useful to do some workshopping around that. But let me first address one methodological research question, and then go maybe to the most controversial, to some of the more technical kind of issues that have come up. On the methodology issue, one, I just wanted to see that it was quite interesting that both Shaili, you, as well as Samir Ubale were of the same view, one coming from a journalism background and one being from the government. The press is not a panacea, but it is very much a very important part of how perceptions have been judged. So we've all been misquoted. So we don't take every press article for it's not valuable research, but it did give us a lot of very insightful understanding of how various cities, what was being reported, and what were the underlying reasons for that. And the new mechanisms around research instruments, this is emerging as a very important area to look at. In terms of, let's say, social media, all local governments, districts, local municipal commissioners, municipalities, all of them now have Twitter, Facebook accounts of their own and are tweeting this, tweeting from their accounts. In smaller cities too, it's not only in the larger cities. So the amount of data that is being generated from both government and non-government sources is a very important, is emerging to be a very important data source. Given the study was being done during COVID times, we had limitations on how to go about the primary research around this study. And therein, we found this mechanism to be quite useful to give us a quick ground level understanding across cities, across geographies, in comparison with each other. And this is done at scale. So there were 6.5 million articles reviewed through keyword searches globally and 6.3 in India. So another 6.3 in India. So these are really large databases. So they're not based on individual articles, readings of individual articles. Yeah. So so just by the volume of it, we are hoping that many of the biases are taken in account. But as you saw, there are biases about international reporting versus Indian reporting, which do form the debate. But that is that we've taken that to reflect what perceptions and key points of discussion were emerging in people in different communities where we did not have direct access to them. So that was just a methodological clarification. On most of the others, as I mentioned, we are very much on the same plane. But I would like to submit here to Professor Mehrotra to pick his third point first. That the legacy of what is urban in India is very much related to this phase of urbanization, historic phase of urbanization in a long-term historic track, which is its fifth period of urbanization, going back straight, very clearly to colonial times. Yeah. Means a pre-colonial urbanization in one sense was quite different. In colonial times, the cities that are mega cities today were set up. There were none of that in the late 17th century. A whole set of new other cities were part of the urban landscape then. And much of these governance systems, the job of the revenue officer, in the bureaucracy in agrarian times of colonial India was precisely that, to make sure that every penny reaches the coffers in Delhi, and the least is spent in local areas. So the design loop of that long-term impact of those processes are very much what we are suffering from. And the idea means the point of, and to link it to Dr. Roy's issues around the points of change or the entry points, means in this gamut, how does this debate turn around? So means what triggers reform? So at this current stage, I completely agree with you, Dr. Mehrotra, that we are in a centralizing mode. Yeah. Means even the Finance Commission, whatever said and done, has increased local body finances, or the allocation to local bodies than the last Finance Commission, that given. However, they have tied up most of that money in a top-down fashion and not laid it out for free, decentralized, decision-making, right? Means I am surprised and shocked in one sense to see that devolution is now being monitored by ministries and Government of India. So our urban ministry, which had no clue of all of this, is being told that you say that your 1,37,000 crores, which is part of devolution, is actually ministry budget being spent on urban development. So means where we are headed is kind of hard to decipher, given that the rules of the game are changing, are shifting, so to say, right? Means when let's say the 12th Finance Commission first gave urban areas resources for waste management, there was a lot of debate around the way Gujarat did it versus the way Madhya Pradesh was doing it. Madhya Pradesh this was straight devolved from the state. They didn't care. They didn't even look at how much came. They passed it to the local bodies. In Gujarat, there was a company set up called Gujarat Urban Development Corporation, which was on behalf of the local bodies through a signed agreement. All the funds were transferred back to the company at the state level. Yeah. And then they were to monitor and whatever, all of that. So there were mechanisms built in to do that. And there was lots of discussion around whether this is more effective or that is more effective. This is just, that is just. And then today we see this happening at all India scale. So means means it really changes our basic rules, and means I'm not even sure whether it's sustainable, and there will be a lot of contraction in the expenditures that local bodies do just because of the bureaucracy that's going to get involved in making these funds available. So just from that aspect, I completely agree with you. It's a matter of big discussion. Means we should put it out for discussion more deeply. But means to look at how do we get to China's, or let's say it's not only China, even a lot of East Asia does it that way, that the city mayors are all powerful and they were responsible for raising monies for the national government. And in the bargain, they were incentivized to raise more money and therefore keep more money and pass on more. And then the top-down devolution was more directed, and they were put in competition with each other about their contribution to GDP, etc. So quite an interesting bottom-up, in that sense, fiscal management system. In India, how do we get to anything like that, given that we are going to have to fight even more basic issues around being at the same spot that we were, just in the last Finance Commission, is itself, the battles that I think we need to fight. So I don't even know how to strategically enter a debate like this. But then coming back to Dr. Roy's issue around, planning, and this Dr. Mehrotra, you too mentioned, is that there are these long-term processes that inform planning too. And these long-term processes in India, in one sense, have been quite, in my opinion, from my readings, much more compassionate. Yeah, means the run for the large and multi-storied city has been something that India is just about kind of witnessing, and it hasn't been so much in the past. However, it does not compare with the US sprawls. Means the US sprawl of Atlanta or something like that is, and most cities, is of a completely different geography in nature. Means the sprawls are much larger than in India. So how urban form is developing and what it means for lower income folk in the city is another area. Means I don't think the pandemic has made much difference, because in that sphere of pure design itself, is because if you look at both the most livable city in Europe, or you look at Manhattan, they've been equally affected. To differentiate between the COVID impact across those two different models of more decentralized public transport based urban areas of, let's say, Amsterdam, for example, in Europe, or versus Manhattan, there isn't too much that differentiates them. So we aren't yet being able to link planning form directly to the COVID situation. But the unplanned nature versus planned nature surely allows us different sets of instruments. In unplanned means Tikender ji told us about Pune. Pune is one of India's smartest cities. If you were to imagine smartest in that particular narrow way, it did put out in its first map. They have a very active website that maps the city and puts. There's lots of information there. But in its first round, it put out every COVID patient was a GPS category. You could see every patient on that map in the first month that COVID came out. So smartness was not was not cunning, wasn't very clever. They were told at one time that no, you can't do that. You can't have every debt and everything as a dot on that map publicly for view of the whole world. And so then they have diluted it and put it at ward level. That information is still available at the ward level, right? Means the issue around data and how to use it, I think, is going to be a lesson out of this. And I think some of these systems are going to improve quite rapidly. I'm hoping. But I also see that there has been a momentum building around it. So I think that might be one of the more positive things that come out of it. On the slum, non-slum issue, I'm not very sure. This whole issue around formal, informal, and how do you take that into the, let's say, the employment area too? What you started the meeting with, Dr. Mehrotra, is about, in the formal workforce, what happened and what happened in the informal workforce. What can we define as the new formal, which is inclusive of both these categories, so that information can flow from one to the other. And there aren't different data capture systems operating at both ends of the bucket, which are not necessarily easy to integrate or use in that sense. How do we think about that from a data perspective? I'm very keen to discuss that further, but that also has its impact on the urban planning sphere, where areas are clubbed out as informal settlements versus formal settlements. So it has ramifications across public service delivery, but urban planning as well as employment and health benefits, right? Social security in that sense. I think there are some common themes, Dr. Roy, that we can isolate, and I think that what we tried to do in the report is these 3 chapters around integrated planning, around illuminating formal, informal, and looking at legal frameworks in support of both of these, were with the view to try and see whether those can be entry points into the debate, and then see how it affects planning, how it affects employment, education, health, etc., and come up with more micro ways, systemic ways of dealing with the micro issues that come out of that kind of a framework. So I'll leave it there. I'll again just thank Arjun for putting this together. I request you, Arjun, that even Mr. Panwar mentioned, the big issue around whether we should relook at, whether there is a new, whether there's an opportunity to look at a new urbanism beyond neoliberal urbanism. All of this needs a lot more discussion. There are various ways of doing it. The NITI Aayog is just one way of doing it. But beyond that, historically, urban planning movements and have come about when a set of individuals in their field get together to solve common problems. Yeah. And that then becomes a movement. We could look at some of these models going forward, but I would love to remain engaged in this debate with this wonderful set of panelists. And so thank you so much for your insights again.
So thank you, Dr. Dasgupta, for your elaborate reply to all the issues, and fortunately the issues which have been raised here, so all of them are more structural or fundamental in nature. So as you rightly mentioned, like, we need more of these sort of city conversation series to address each of them. For example, you talked about these the nuances of formality and informality, and there is an interesting paper by Ananya Roy, why India cannot plan its cities. So if one can read that paper, then one can easily understand the complexities of these, making this distinction between formal and informal in the Indian cities, and how does it actually make the entire planning exercises too difficult. So once again, thank you for, but just let me request you to look at the Q&A box. There are some questions. So if you want to respond to any of them, you can do. Some of them are, I think one of them is directed to Mr. Panwar. So the others are, you may want to respond if you want.
So please unmute.
So there is some questions about the second wave. The second wave, in one sense, for anyone who was following the past, the pandemics or zoonotic diseases, is not really surprising. Means the Spanish flu second wave was 3 times as strong as the first wave. And given that in spite of all the efforts that government at various tiers have tried to put in, means more or less, much of it can be said that, there wasn't really very massive differences between how the reactions government had during the 1918 Spanish flu vis-a-vis now. Means we did have to resort to very similar measures. Of course, healthcare was much better. Healthcare capabilities were much higher. So the second phase in that sense is not surprising. I think some of the lessons are already being learned. For example, state governments are now coming up with pretty comprehensive notifications, unlike daily, hourly notifications, which was creating a lot of chaos in the first round. Means these notifications that I've seen, the last 2 or 3 of them are now deal with all those issues together. In that sense, I think means from the government response perspective, there's been some lesson learning. On the wider issue, means in my view again, that a national lockdown that suddenly came into the picture with only a handful of deaths was kind of thought through. And as we have seen since then, means local lockdowns are more preferred now, so there is surely a movement away from the capacity or the need to do that national lockdown. There are learnings around public transport that are already in play. Governments have announced which are closing or going close to lockdown, however you want to define that word, are now keeping public transport open for frontline workers. So we are seeing some of these lessons already emerge in wave 2, and we'll be continuously studying it as it evolves. Anything else you see, Shomadeep, that
I think you have already addressed many of these issues.
Right.
So anyway, if there are still questions, I think we will forward it to you, and if you want, you can respond over email to them. So thank you once again, and just in the concluding part, let me again request our panelists, Professor Roy, Mr. Panwar, and Mr. Nunale, if you can make your quick closing comments, maybe a minute or so. It's over to you, Professor Roy, for your comments.
Sir, kindly unmute yourself.
So
yes, Professor Sauvanic. Please,
yeah.
please go on.
So probably one comment maybe that yes, second wave is really surging in almost in all the states, and probably a lot of things have been learned from the states which are following a completely welfare-oriented approach towards a more growth-driven model. And in fact, both have something to share. Like, for example, I just give one clue. We have done a study on comparison on Gujarat and Kerala. Okay, so Kerala Kerala, you know that it has been a much praised model. And I also feel that under given circumstances, Kerala is certainly though the spread is very high, but they could contain the fatality rate at a much lower level compared to other states, including Gujarat. But what even Kerala is thinking that they need to also reorient their economic model, that the remittance economy needs to go some kind of shift, so that some production, because Kerala is a consumption state, even the completely the entire, because Kerala, the maximum spread is happening from the southern states, from where the vegetables, fruits, and everything is transported to Kerala. So like that, every state is learning from with itself that what kind of reorientation they need to undergo, and also from the other states in a quite open and I should say there should not be any bias in learning. So we need a restoration of the welfare state model, but certainly the old model, even in the welfare state, will not work. So there's a continuous adaptation or redefining the old model towards a more transformative kind of approach. So that, I think, is my take from this entire last 1 year, what I'm following. So that's what is important. Everybody has to learn from itself, and one state is in fact equal to one country in Europe. So probably the states really, it's very difficult in India. And if we really want to impose a single kind of development model, that's not going to work. So probably India has really a lot to offer in terms of its evolving model, and probably all of the states are learning in the learning curve, and probably a lot to really share in future days to come.
Thank you, Professor Roy. Now may I request Mr. Panwar for your quick 1 minute thought.
Sir, his connection is lost.
Oh, lost. Okay, so is Mr. Runale sir is with us?
Yes.
Yeah,
okay. Yeah,
yeah,
Sameerji. Yeah, please.
Actually,
Okay.
this was a very good discussions. I think I must thank you for allowing me to share my some personal reflections here. And regarding, I think the most important or predominant thought that is in mind right now is one, capacity building, and secondly, learning lessons out of that and institutionalizing them, not only in the government but also in the community. That earlier, you remember during I was told, I still remember the small boy, there was always a siren going on in city which told us to be ready for some airstrikes. That's what our parents told us way back. Maybe in 70, after the 71 war, there was a system of civil defense in cities. So institutionalizing even epidemic management and other disaster management issues will have to be done, and to reach to the community level. It's just not maybe what you and I and maybe some academic think tank and bureaucrats talking, but that issue have to reach to the man on the street, the common man on the street, where he finds a unison in what we are talking. Otherwise, people normally are not interacting, and maybe they respond in deviance in what instructions are given. So making the citizens the central focal point of all such emergency administrative measures, I think should be a important lesson that we should learn, and also try to institutionalize the disaster response mechanism into the larger community by way of more maybe communication and IC and education and training and capacity building of at the community level, and not only at the administrative level. I think that is something that comes to my mind right now. So thank you so much, sir.
So thank you. So I think today's discussion teases us to think a lot about some of the fundamental and structural urban problems. And if I try to think of it, some of the important takeaways of today's discussions, I can think of three important takeaways. One is surely the COVID-19 strong regional impact calls for differentiated governance and policy response. And secondly, access to essential public services is going to be the key for effective COVID-19 response and building resilience to the future crises in the cities. And thirdly, strengthening the capacities of local actors, particularly the local governments, is also very, very crucial. So with this, let me now request Dr. Arjun Kumar, who is the director of this IMPRI, to please share your comments and give the formal vote of thanks. It's over to you, Arjun.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. It's quite late, but really very much required. And I would really like to congratulate and thank Shubhagato sir for bringing forth this study and also the result. I would say the major highlights would be, again, the focus which Shubhagato sir has been leading since a decade through his institution, Sci-Fi Initiative. The focus on housing, basic amenities, sanitation, public hygiene, more so, which are more required. So all the governance issues which also he has highlighted, many macro issues also, but the study really highlights all these major insights, and sir has also tried to cover also the latest and more impactful what our central government also thinks, PM Swanidhi and one ration, one card, and so many of other things also tried to cover, which has really now the impactful lesson for this current second wave. So let me give a vote of thanks for this very important discussion today on this study report, which has come from Sci-Fi Initiative at CPR by Shubhagato sir, Reform, Lesson for Urban Governance, Futures from the Pandemic. So we thank you, Dr. Shubhagato Dasgupta sir, for enlightening us on this very important issue. And we are very thankful to our chair, Professor Santosh Mehrotra, for bringing upon his labor economist point of view also, and also the major economic macro areas also highlighting that what could be done. I remember we also organized a lecture by Dr. Amit Basole under this series only from the APU study, as IMPRI study, that there is urban social security is required, and Professor Santosh Mehrotra highlighted that PM Kishan should be extended to the urban poor. And now the time is so, crucial as the second wave, and this study reform also highlights that that is something which is required. So thank you, our chair also, and our discussants, Professor Sauvanic, thank you so much, sir, for highlighting so many issues. Tikender Singh Panwar sir, Samirun Nare sir, Sally, Simi could not join because of travel. And thank you very much, Dr. Soumyadeep Chattopadhyay sir, for moderating this session and bringing forth so many of issues. We look forward to all of you to learning more in the future. And I wish you all a very nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shubhagato sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Samir. Thank you, Samir. Have a good night.